Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at part 2 of this NH35 Submariner build inspired by the Artisans de Geneve rough mat. In the first part of the video series, I went ahead and cleaned up and prepared the hands as well as the hour markers for paint and lume. And what I actually have here is BGW9 Superluminova powder. I purchased this powder because, as you know, the original hands came with some not so good green lume already inside them, and the hour markers for this build came completely bare, no paint and no lume. The lume powder is actually from a kit which also contained a binding agent as well as a thinning agent. I purchased said kit off of eBay from what appears to be a German seller. The listing was very detailed and contained everything from performance stats to specifications, what was in the kit, and of course, mixing ratios. A 1-to-1 ratio of pigment to binder was listed as a good ratio for easy application. However, a 1.5-to-1 pigment to binder ratio was listed for brightest performance. I, of course, was not concerned with an easy application and opted for the 1.5-to-1 ratio. And you will soon see that I did not accomplish this. I start off by adding 0.06 grams of the pigment powder to the mixing bowl. Then I go ahead and I add 0.09 grams of the binding agent to the bowl, way out of whack with the ratios that are recommended. I knew at this point I was going to have to add more pigment to the bowl, but I did want to give everything a mix just to see if it actually would mix first off. Tapping on the vial, I eventually get 0.04 grams to fall out of it and decide that that's close enough, even though I still have way too much binder when compared to the original 1.5-to-1 ratio. As you would expect, this did not yield great results with the brightness of the lume. I actually had quite varied results in the color and brightness of the lume in different parts of the watch. For instance, in the hands, they are blue and do glow, while in the markers, they're rather white and glow a lot less. This was my first attempt at luming hands and markers, and I do expect to give it another try in a future video, as I do still have plenty of lume, which is a story we'll get into in just a minute. Here's the first look at the now painted hour markers and hands. Well, the hour markers. As you can see, the hands are upside down. As for the luming process, it's actually pretty simple. I'm using one of the included oilers to transfer the lume solution into the hour markers. The hour markers have a bit of a recess, so as long as I don't accidentally overfill them with too much lume, they won't overflow, and we'll have a nice border around each of the markers. I, of course, was careful not to paint outside of the lines, as I didn't really know how to clean up any of the mess. So now let's talk about why I ended up having much more lume than I originally needed. Back in December, my parents started asking if there was anything in particular I wanted for Christmas. Knowing that I wanted to build this watch in the future, I told them that some BGW9 lume would be nice, and I left it at that. Well, Christmas came around, and neither my parents or good old Saint Nick brought me lume powder. I didn't think too much of it. I figured that the information I had provided them with was not enough for them to go off of, or simply it was too late and they were not able to order any. A few days later, however, all hell broke loose. As it turned out, my parents did try to order some luminous powder. However, what they received was birchwood. What they initially believed to be an honest mistake slowly turned into them thinking that they had been scammed. They did their best to contact the seller and state that they had received the incorrect package. However, whoever they were dealing with was either from France or only spoke a little bit of English, and communications were very brief and hard to coordinate. Thinking that my parents had been scammed, I did the smart thing and ordered my own luminous powder from a different vendor. A few days pass by and I get sent a picture from my father. It's a vial and a caption that reads, "Is this what you wanted?" All the labeling on the vial looked correct, so I replied, "Yes, that's the right powder." Apparently, my father had received 2 packages. He opened one of them, which contained birchwood. He was sent the wrong package. He never figured to open up the other package to see if what he actually ordered was inside of it. It turned out that me buying my own Lume kit was not a bad idea, as the purchase they made was only for the luminous powder and did not contain the binder or the thinner. So why are the hour and minute hand upside down on 2 plots of Rodico? The luminous material is actually applied to the underside of the hand. It's not filled in like it is in the hour markers. The overall goal is to add just enough lume so that it suspends itself across the opening in the hand with no perforations. This, of course, comes down to how the mixture was prepared and in what ratio the binder and the powder was used. Of course, with me overshooting the mark and using more binder than powder, it actually went on very easily, and that's why it didn't work. In future builds, I plan to put the luminous powder into the mixing crucible and then add small amounts of the binder until all of the powder has been dissolved. I'll then try to apply the mixture to the hands, and if it does not spread as I like, I will add more binder until the right consistency is reached. Eventually, with enough trips back to the well, I'm able to get the lume to spread out across the hand. And with one little correction to one of the hour markers, I'm pleased with the results, and I can move on to the dial. For this build, I'm using a dark blue sunburst dial with my favorite Relax logo. As I mentioned previously, when I placed the order for this dial, I asked the dial maker to not install any of the indices, as I wanted them to be painted and then lumed by myself. He of course obliged, as it's the same amount of money for less work. Though at this point, I had not installed any hour markers onto a dial, I had a pretty good idea of how it would go down and the processes needed to make it work. At each of the 12 positions around the dial, barring the 3 o'clock position, which holds the date window, there's a set of 3 holes. The set consists of 1 large hole flanked by 2 smaller holes. Now on the back of the hour markers, there's either 1 large pin or 2 smaller pins. For instance, this triangular indice that I'm using at the 12 o'clock position has 2 small pins. All that's required is that I line up the 2 small pins with the 2 small holes in the set and then push down gently on the indice. Having 2 small pins on the non-circular hour markers ensures that they line up straight. What you see me waving around here is a UV light pen. I'm using it to cure the UV resin I placed on the back of the marker before placing it on the dial. On this style of dial, 1 o'clock is represented by a circular marker. Unlike the triangular and rectangular shaped markers, the circular markers just have one large pin in the center. Again, I've placed just the tiniest amount of UV resin on that pin and the back of the marker before placing it down onto the dial. And here, I'm going to use a micro Q-tip to just gently push it down. Psych! I'm going to use my plastic tweezers to gently push it down, make sure it's flat. That little pin on the back of the marker is less than 1 millimeter, so I really need the marker to be flush with the dial to make sure that it's pushed all the way through. And then once again, breaking out the UV pen, and this time shining it on the front of the dial as well as the back of the dial, just to make sure that all that resin is exposed to UV light. Just going back here to add a touch more of the UV resin to the back of the dial before hitting it once more with the UV light just to make sure that everything is cured. And though it's out of focus, you can see I'm just ever so gently dabbing that marker onto the micro Q-tip that is soaked in the UV resin. Just like the Lume, it's key to get the correct amount of the UV resin on the back of the marker. Too much and it'll overflow onto the dial. Too little and it will not hold the marker in place. To eliminate one of these issues, what I eventually ended up doing was just placing the marker in its spot and then taking the Q-tip with the resin on it and painting it on the back of the dial. I was able to eliminate the risk of overflow while still maintaining a good strong hold on all of the markers on the dial. I also have to say, this UV pen has been a great asset for charging a Lume. Just 1 or 2 seconds over a dial and the hands and markers light up like a Christmas tree. Here I'm going to loosen up the movement holder and rotate the dial about 90 degrees. This will just make it a little bit easier to apply the UV resin to the back side of the dial. Securing the dial into place, I'm once again just going to add a little bit more of the UV resin to the back side of the dial just to hold that indice in place, and after that I'll hit it with the UV pen. Next is the date window frame, and using a little bit of magic, I'm able to suspend it in place on one side of the tweezers before placing it in the correct location. Switch off to my plastic tweezers here to do my best to eliminate the possibility of scratching the date window frame. Hindsight being 20/20, I guess this would be the best item to scratch as there's no Lume within it, and I could just do that same process again, dissolving the paint and repainting everything. And look at that, in the blink of an eye, I'm already applying resin to the 6 o'clock marker before hitting it with the UV pen. Trust me, you, the viewer, did not miss anything. It's the same process. Place the marker down, put the UV resin on the back, cure the UV resin with the UV light. With a little bit of repetitive watch building going on in the background, perhaps I could speak about the reference watch. This is going to be a problem in itself because there really isn't a lot of information out about the Artisans de Geneve rough mat. For instance, when you Google Artisans de Geneve rough mat and then select videos, 3 videos show up. The first 2 are the same, and the third one is the part 1 of this series. I've really got my SEO down. There's a few promotional pictures of the watch, but none really of it in the real world. There's a handful of articles discussing the watch and its customization, one claiming that the customization cost $20,000, and the other claiming that 26 of these were made. The claim of this customization costing $20,000, I believe. However, originally, I did not believe that there was 26 of these made. This does appear to be true, as multiple articles make reference to it, and on the case back, there is an engraving for 1 of 26. This is a little shocking, as Artisans de Geneve usually only does one-offs for its clients. With 26 of them being available, I expected to see more pictures of them out in the real world. With that said, there does appear to be one listed for sale at around $29,000. So right around the price of a modern Rolex Submariner plus a $20,000 customization fee. If anybody is interested in purchasing this piece, I'm happy to sell it to you at a price far less than $29,000. As always, please feel free to reach out at my email at goldenstatewatchshop@gmail.com or via Instagram at goldenstatewatchshop. With a little bit of magic, we can see I've completed the dial and all 11 hour markers are in place, along with the date window frame. I'm pretty happy with the results. I like the way that the orange markers play off the sunburst blue dial. I do wish that the Lume was working better and came out a little bit smoother. With the dial now complete, I can look at painting the seconds hand, which was a relatively easy and short operation. Starting off, I don't exactly remember why I placed a red solo plate down before placing the seconds hand on top of it. And now, for the moment of truth, I'm going to add a little bit of orange enamel paint over the red paint on the seconds hand. With perfect form, I'm able to complete the operation in one attempt, and now I can look forward to the bezel. Moving on to the final section of this video, we'll discuss the bezels of the build. So the first bezel you saw was the first bezel I ordered, and when it arrived it ended up being about 1/2 millimeter too small. Luckily, I was able to find the correct size of bezel in a very similar color and ordered one of those. And when it arrived, I decided to scrape out all of the white paint inside the dive markers, as I saw a video where Marshall from Wristwatch Revival does this same step and then repaints the dive markers in a black color. However, the orange color I got after doing this wasn't vibrant at all, and I elected to yet again purchase another bezel and leave the white paint in before painting over it with the orange. As you can see, the bezel on the right is much more brown and muted when compared to the test bezel on the left. In that same Wristwatch Revival video, Marshall mentioned that it's pretty easy to repaint dive markers, as all that's required is to repaint the marker and then using a finger or thumb, run it over the bezel, and that will remove all of the excess paint. And like the Maury show, that was a lie. Or I wasn't thinning the paint enough, or I was using the wrong paint. What this means for me is that I must simply carefully paint inside the lines of all the dive markers, which I soon found to be harder than I anticipated. A lot of the work you see me do on this channel is done without the aid of magnification. This is mainly done in the attempt of keeping my big head out of the camera shot. But for this task, magnification was definitely needed, and off camera I went back and cleaned up any missing spots or any messes that I made. In the video, this will be a relatively short operation, but just know that For about a week, I would come home from work and slowly paint and then chip away, paint and then chip away at this bezel until I got it to a point where I'm pretty happy with it. I say I'm pretty happy with the bezel because over time some areas would dry and then I would add wet paint on top of that, which would dry on top of the dry paint, leaving a little bit of a texture or a bump in some areas. I would have much rather had a perfectly smooth finish, however that wasn't in the cards this time around. So why paint the first 10-minute indications on the dive bezel? It's more of an aesthetic choice than anything really. The dive bezel or timing bezel of this watch is mainly used to do just that, time things, more specifically, time dives. To use this bezel, you would rotate it until the triangle aligns with the minute hand. From there, time would elapse, and when the event has concluded, the minute hand would show how much time had passed. As I mentioned, the main purpose of a dive bezel would be to time a scuba dive. At first, I thought the orange was put in place to signify danger. However, regarding the first 10 minutes of the dive, I don't believe there to be that much danger at that time. That said, I don't scuba dive, I've never been scuba diving, so for all I know, the first 10 minutes could be the most dangerous. If any of you are experienced scuba divers and have any idea what the orange might represent in regards to the first 10 minutes, please let me know down in the comments. Though I did my best not to, there was points in this process where I did paint outside of the lines. So to clean those areas up, I'm using an oiler, again from the Lume kit, to scrape away all the excess paint. With the bezel being made of ceramic and thus highly scratch resistant, I knew this would have no effect on it. Eventually, I traded in the oiler for an X-Acto knife, which allowed me to be more precise with where I was scraping and the paint I was removing. I'm going to go ahead and cut the video off here, and in part 3, we'll look at the preparations and modifications that went into the case and bracelet. We'll see you there. Thanks for watching.